despite the massive blip caused by Superstorm Sandy. This campaign has been all about jobs, jobs and jobs. Earlier, our reporters headed into the city of Las Vegas, which has the highest unemployment in the States, a place for many where the American dream has indeed become the ultimate nightmare. We saw middle-class people losing their homes, selling blood to pay for internet bills and gas, and the sad tale of a couple being forced to live in a storm drain. So let's just take a look at the official poverty statistics, which shows that the rate of poverty among children in the United States has risen to 21.9% this year, while it's 13.7% for adults aged 18 and over. However, the overall jobs picture has brightened a bit and the unemployment rate has fallen to 7.8%. Now, joining me in the studio is Christopher Dickey, the Paris Bureau Chief for Newsweek. Also, Aja Monet, an American novelist living here in Paris, who says she won't be voting in the election because she believes neither candidate has the capability of understanding the lot of poor people. And from Washington, D.C., Tim Kaine, the chief economist with the conservative-leaning think tank, the Hudson Institute. But before we begin our discussion, I'm going to head across to Miami, Florida, a major swing state, and also where our correspondent, Doug Hanks, is. Doug has been following Governor Romney's campaign in the last few days. Doug, thanks for joining us. Firstly, as we saw, the campaign was momentarily overshadowed by Sandy, but at the end of the day, on voting day, it's all going to be about jobs, isn't it?
That's the assumption. The economy remains number one despite the drama we've seen this week with the storm. And for sure, the presidential campaign resumed in earnest today when the president returned to the campaign trail, hitting all the close states, including Florida, and is back to making his case for how he's going to turn the economy around and why Governor Romney is the wrong choice. Of course, Governor Romney's making the exact opposite argument, but it's all about the economy and reassuring people that if their plan gets adopted, if that candidate's plan gets adopted, they won't hit this kind of poverty seen in that piece.
And certainly in Governor Romney's case, the gloves are well and truly off and he's back to full attack mode, isn't he, Doug?
Yes, and there was some question as to what the tone would be post-Sandy, and it does seem to be building back towards that boxing match mentality in terms of hitting the other candidate, somewhat typical in the final days of the election. But we're also probably going to see more of a positive message for what they call the closing argument, why you should vote for me, as opposed to why you should vote against the other candidate. We'll probably see that in the next 48 hours.
And it's a very different mood, isn't it, this time compared to 4 years ago? And given that you're in a swing state, what is the voters' mood like? I mean, have you been coming across numerous people who are well and truly disillusioned with both candidates?
Well, absolutely. And in 2008, what was working for Barack Obama was the cliche, the hope, the optimism, the thought that this is a new, novel candidate. He's been president for 4 years. He owns the economy. And that's why you're seeing a more cynical electorate this year. Not to say that that they're not more or less willing to vote for Barack Obama. It's very close. It might be the closest election we've seen in our lifetime or in a generation. But for sure, it's just not the same amount of optimism as there was in 2008. At the same time, there's not the same amount of anxiety either about the economy. We're not in the midst of a financial crisis. We are looking back at one.
Correspondent in Miami, Doug Hanks, thank you for that. Christopher Dickey, just bringing you in. It's very interesting that all we hear about in the last months or so is the demise of the American middle class, but we don't hear about the poor, do we?
Well, you know, the United States is an interesting society when it comes to the middle class. First of all, everybody is sort of thinks he's middle class in the United States. People, even when they're poor, tend not to admit they're poor. They're just on the lower edge of the middle class. And when people get very rich, they don't really say, well, I'm the upper class. They say, well, I'm upper middle class. It's sort of like middle age or sort of late middle age when you get old. But the truth is that there is this huge division in society in the United States. And the rich are incredibly rich, and everybody else is much, much less rich. That's why Romney could talk about 47% of the population being essentially people who would never vote for him because they were not rich people. And they supposedly are depending on the government and they're supposedly freeloaders. Isn't true, of course, but that was the message he was trying to get across. His real message is twofold. One, I'm going to help the rich people, and the other is to convince people who are in the middle class or even poor people, I'm going to help make you rich. Now, is that what he's going to do? I don't think so, but that's the political game.
Ajamone, do you have any comment on that?
I just think that the illusion of what it means to be rich, this idea that we have propagated within the American consciousness, this American dream, our values are about that. And so at any extent at which we do not have this idea of what rich is, then we start to feel defeated. We start to feel incomplete. We start to call names. We start to say, you're poor. The poor, who is the poor? Who are we talking about? Because if you have rich, at some point there is going to be poor. And so what are we arguing for? If we put Mitt Romney in office or we put Obama in office, there's still going to be poverty. And I think the difference is, and everybody's arguing about, is what's the face of poverty going to be? Is it going to be white? Is it going to be black? Is it going to be Asian? Is it going to be women? Is it going to be men? At the end of the day, the people who are affected the most are women and children.
Aja, but you're not voting in the election. Isn't that a defeatist attitude, given that there are some sort of glimmers of hope on the horizon?
It depends on where you see hope. I am an artist. I'm a poet first and foremost, and I'm a human being. I know my experience as a human being, as coming from Brooklyn, coming from a single mother who raised me, and I understand that the system, regardless of whether or not it is Obama or it is Bush or it is Clinton, has always led itself with a rich and a poor. It has always worked that way. That is not an American problem. This is not something that we can sit.
Aja, I gotta say, you keep talking as if the economy is strictly a zero-sum game. That you're going to have rich people and you're going to have poor people, and there's no situation where those poor people can get to have more money or get rich.
If that is your goal.
You can't have an economy that in fact creates wealth for everybody. It's got to be rich people and it's got to be poor people. I think what Obama would argue is that you can have an economy where the opportunity is well distributed and where the opportunity to be solidly in the middle class is available to a lot more
Not
people
with this current government.
if you don't concentrate all the wealth in 1% of the population.
With this current government.
I think there's a.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think there's a valid point that poverty has been with us, and it's really ridiculous. This is an incredibly rich country, and we have programs. And I'm sorry to turn from the poetry to the economics. I grew up with one pair of shoes. My mom worked in a cafeteria. I remember what it was like. And again, I'm an American, so I wasn't poor. I was middle class, to Christopher's point. But it's always baffled me when I started to study the economy. We have programs in this country that incent people, that create an incentive to stay poor. So we pay people if they don't have a job. We pay people if they're out of work. We need to really think about the incentive structures.
To stay poor.
No, there's a huge incentive. If there's a family that makes $25,000 a year, listen, if there's a family that has $25,000 a year as their income and then make more money up to $35,000, they actually lose because they lose so many federal benefits. Those incentives are destructive to our dignity.
Do you think it is an honorable thing for American citizens who are poor to be dependent on the American system? Do you think that they want to be poor? You think
Absolutely
they want to be
not.
reliant on the system? Is that what you're implying?
I was one of these people.
Aja.
Of course, and I'm not implying that at all. I'm implying we shouldn't have stupid government programs. We should have programs that help people raise themselves up rather than holding them down because they love their children.
This sounds like we're back in the days of 1970s welfare. We're not back in those days. Welfare has been systematically cut back for 25 years. People are not on welfare. We don't even call it welfare anymore to the extent that we give it at all. People survive on food stamps. And as you well know, the Republican candidates have talked as if the food stamps themselves are a sin. Let them starve. Don't even let them eat cake.
No, come on. Christopher, nobody said that. Nobody said let them starve. We have $1 trillion in spending on welfare programs across 86 different programs. It's not like we're
86
a
different
bunch of
programs
Scrooges in this country.
Yes, you know perfectly well what we're talking about. You know perfectly well that that's been an issue that's come up again and again, that more people are on food stamps, and you know that the tone of that issue has been one that says those people are wrong to be on food stamps.
Does anyone ask why there needs to be food stamps? Does anyone ask?
Tim Kaine, let me just ask you a question. Part of the problem with Mitt Romney's campaign is that he's a very, very wealthy businessman and that he is disconnected from the harsh economic reality that many Americans currently face. Do you not agree that it's very hard, particularly when you hear people such as Aja and Christopher here talk? I mean, how is Romney going to get that support?
Well, Romney in most polls right now among independent voters is about 10 points, sometimes 20 points ahead. That includes swing states. So those, I mean, I would say these are the moderate centrist Americans don't hold that grudge. In fact, they appreciate, like Steve Jobs was a very wealthy guy who created Apple Computer. And yet we admire that. We admire that entrepreneurial spirit.
Mitt
Romney invested in a company called Staples, which most Americans shop at for cheaper office products. So I don't think that's been a problem at all. They want someone who appreciates job creation.
Christopher, in terms of President Obama, I mean, granted, as he says, he inherited a legacy, but clearly he's having problems too, convincing the electorate to go his way. I mean, it's a nail-biting campaign.
I think Jim actually is putting his finger on a problem that really is a core problem of Obama, which is that he has, and Aja too, in a way, because Obama has tried to represent the interests of the vast majority of Americans who are not rich and who are never going to get rich. But in doing that, he hasn't really encouraged poor people to believe in him, and he has deeply alienated the commercial interests of the United States. I mean, I don't know any businessmen who are going to vote for Obama. They think that he hates them. And some of that is emotional. Some of that's a result of policies. Some of that is a result of the red tape he helped create.
I think his biggest message is that, and this is what he's been saying throughout his campaign, is that we have to change the things that we would like to see happen. And it's not going to come from an economist. It's not going to come from two people sitting at a table right now. It's coming from the people that are working in foster cares and housing developments and education systems. These are people that do not have the time to sit here and discuss these
but
policies.
But if you think that's his big message in his campaign, why aren't you voting for him?
Because I do not believe that the issue of being able to support what he's saying is coming out of his policies. I do not think that his support of drones, I do not think that $1.4 billion given to collection agencies to get money out of students who cannot afford college, I do not think his attacks and his wars against students like me that deserve an education. What is my education worth to you? That is something that is my right. And these are things that he's defending that is not his fault. It's not him alone, it's his administration. He has an administration that he represents, and there are people that Mitt Romney represents that do not show my demographic, that do not exemplify.
Do you think your demographic is going to be better represented by Mitt Romney?
I believe that politicians serve a specific purpose, and that purpose does not fulfill the purpose of individual citizens, and that individual citizens have to start standing up for their own beliefs.
I love this, Aja. You're taking me back to the 60s and my revolutionary days.
That's very insulting of my intelligence because it's very now. It's very real now.
Tim, you've got a comment there to make from Washington.
Yeah, that disappointment is so palpable, and I understand it. You know, President Obama came in and he said, if you pass this very big stimulus bill, I will get unemployment down to about 5% by the end of my first term. And of course, it's just under 8%. So people are very frustrated that the promises on the left, and that stimulus program was, 99.9% Democratic heavy program. It hasn't worked for 50 years. We had a war on poverty, very well intentioned, started under Lyndon Johnson, and it hasn't worked. So I think we need just a different mindset about incentives. And appreciate, and I think Mitt Romney did misspeak on this, appreciate that the poorest Americans want an opportunity. They don't want to be victims. They don't feel like victims. And yet our government policies really do treat them that way.
Tim,
that, well, we have to coddle them and just pay them money and not give them a ladder up.
Tim, but the reality is the country's highest salary earners in the last decade have seen the largest gains, as opposed to the middle class whose gains have dropped.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it misses the issue. You can't confuse inequality with poverty, because when you go after rich people, and this has been seen around Europe, the rich people leave. They'll go to another country. It happens here in states like in California, where they have very steep taxes aimed at rich people. Rich people are leaving California, and poverty's worsened there. Now, some people say that's because we have so many immigrants in California, and let's stop the immigration. I disagree with that. I don't think you can cure poverty by beating up immigrants. I think immigrants are a great strength. But I do think also going to war against rich people, you're going to just diminish opportunities for everyone.
Aja, on Wednesday morning, when you wake up, and if indeed President Obama is re-elected for a second term, would you be relieved?
Relieved, if only for what it represents to certain people in America, yes. If that's necessary to get people to be inspired to start doing things in their lives that change individual decisions that are made. But I do not think that there will be much change. There's been not much change since Bush in my existence. From Clinton to Bush to Obama, I do not feel the difference in any grave way.
Christopher, what are you hoping for on Wednesday morning?
Oh, I couldn't really say. Actually, I've already voted, but I can't really say who I voted for. You might guess, but...
Tim, obviously, I would imagine who you're backing.
Yeah, I think it's sort of obvious for me. Although I'll say out front, I still admire John Kennedy. He was a tax-cutting Democrat. My grandfather was a tax-cutting Democrat. It's not about party for me. It's about someone that appreciates entrepreneurship, and I think that's Mitt Romney. So I'm hopeful.
Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for. And so what I'd like to do is thank my guests this evening, Christopher Dickey, Aja Monet here in Paris, and in Washington, D.C., Tim Kaine. Now, coming up next is a wrap of the day's business news with Marcus Carlson. Do stay with us here on France 24.